This is a Reigate Grammar School Biology Department video on plant sexual reproduction. And why not start with a lovely image like this? This is a bumblebee, and what it's doing here is collecting nectar and pollen from this flower here. And you can see this structure, this organ on the bee here. This is a pollen basket. It's part of its rear pair of legs. It collects pollen into there in order to carry it back where they will use pollen as food. This is a dissection of an insect pollinated flower. What parts do we see? We see the female parts, and I've labelled the female parts on the left hand side. Altogether you'd call the female parts the carpels. They're all the carpels. But we need to know the individual names for each individual part. So up the top we've got the stigma. That's the part where pollen needs to get to if that flower is going to be pollinated. Supporting the stigma is the style. Just as a style will support you if you go for a country walk and you need to climb over a fence, you may find a stile in that fence. Then below that is the ovary, and the ovary contains the ovules. The ovules are the female gametes, and they contain, each one of them contains an ovum or egg. On the right hand side I've labelled the male parts. The male parts are called the stamens, and the stamen is composed of two parts. One, the anther. It's the anther which produces pollen. Pollen is the male gamete, and the anther is held up by the filament. This is just a look at anthers ripening and maturing. On the left hand side we've got an unripe anther, and as that anther gets older, the pollen in it matures, and the anther dries out, cracks open, and is ready now to release its pollen. This is a wind pollinated flower. Now, in contrast to the insect pollinated flower, this one has very small petals and they're not colourful. But also it has other features. Now it has anthers and a stigma, just as the insect pollinated plant did. But let's have a look at them. This here is an anther. It's hanging outside the flower. It's hanging outside the flower in order to be caught by the wind, so that the pollen can then be released away to the air. Likewise, the stigma hangs outside the flower such that, or so that, air or wind carrying pollen will be blown towards it, and it'll catch that pollen and therefore be pollinated. And actually, if you let your lawn grow a little bit, and you let the grass grow, you'll find that you see these flowers, and if you give them time, you can actually have a look at the tiny little anthers hanging out of grass flowers. You need to know the difference between the flowers of insect pollinated and wind pollinated plants. We'll start with the position of the stamens. Just as we've said, well, in the insect pollinated flower, the stamens are enclosed within the flower, so the insect must make contact with it if the insect is to get to the nectary right at the base of the flower. Whereas in wind pollinated, well, the stamens holding the anthers are exposed so that the wind can easily blow the pollen away from the anther. The stigma is, in an insect pollinated plant, again enclosed within the flower, so the insect must make contact, but in the wind pollinated, exposed to catch the pollen blowing in the wind. The insect pollinated stigma is sticky, so that the pollen grains attached to the insect will stick to the stigma. Whereas the wind pollinated stigma is feathery to catch pollen blowing in the wind. This is a little typo here. It should say sticky, so pollen grains attached to insects stick to the stigma. Insect pollinated flowers have large petals. Wind pollinated flowers have small petals. And insect-pollinated flowers have petals which are brightly coloured versus dull-coloured ones in wind-pollinated. Nectaries, well, they will only ever be present in insect-pollinated flowers and will never ever be present in wind-pollinated flowers. They would be a total waste of resources for the plant, as it is not using insects to transfer its pollen. And the pollen grains themselves, insect-pollinated pollen is small and sticky, whereas wind-pollinated plant pollen is larger, inflated, so that the grains will be carried in the wind further. It's worth thinking at this point why plants do this at all. Well, the advantage of sexual reproduction is sexual reproduction has the great advantage of giving you the opportunity to mix your genes with the genes of another individual. Now that means your offspring will have greater variation, and in a changing environment, that's a great advantage. Because your offspring are more varied, therefore it is likely that quite a number of them will be well adapted to the new environment as it changes. So there's a great premium in being able to reproduce sexually. Indeed, that is why all mammals do reproduce exclusively sexually. We've got to the stage of pollination. What happens next? Well, here we go. By the way, it is worth us reminding ourselves of our definition of pollination, and make sure you get this phrase in your notes. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma. If the pollination occurs on the same plant, i.e. a plant has pollinated itself, that might be the same flower even, or it might be a different flower on the same plant, that is called self-pollination, and there will be much less genetic variation generated by self-pollination. Cross-pollination is when a plant is pollinated by a different plant, a plant of the same species, but a different individual nonetheless. That is cross-pollination, and that is the type of pollination which will lead to greater genetic variation. What happens once pollination occurs? Here is a pollen grain, it's landed on the stigma is a bit sticky, pollen grain's landed, hooray, here we go. What happens next? We'll have a look at these pollen grains here. These have started to grow tubes. You see this little pollen grain growing a tube. And if you look at the end of the tube, there's a darker staining region, and that is the male nucleus, which has left the pollen grain and has travelled down this tube the pollen grain is growing. So here we go. This is one starting here. The tube is started. It's digesting its way using enzymes down the style, and that nucleus is following down. So here we go. This one here. It's digested all the way down using enzymes. It's gone all the way down the style. It's going to be digesting a lot of cellulose, so it'll be using the enzyme cellulase. And we've got this nucleus travelling down this tube. Now, the tube itself knows where to go. It knows where to go. It is a positive chemotropism, and that means that the tip of this tube here is aiming for a chemical released by the ovule. The ovule releases this chemical, and the tube knows just where to go. The tube is also aiming for this small hole in the ovule. This small hole in the integument, the outer covering of the ovule, is called the micropyle. And it is through there that the tube will enter. And as it does, it will act as a delivery tube for this nucleus, this male nucleus. And ultimately, fertilization occurs only when the male nucleus... Where's my cursor gone? Here we go. When the male nucleus manages to be taken inside the ovule and to fuse with the female nucleus. And at that point, our two gametes come together, they fuse, and they form a zygote, just as in humans. That zygote will then divide by mitosis to produce an embryo, an embryonic plant. There are quite a number of ovules in each ovary, typically, and so you'd like quite a lot of pollen grains to pollinate you. Here are some questions so far. Pause the video at this point, have a go at answering these questions, and then once you've answered these questions, move on to the next part of the video. We've got to the stage of fertilization, and once fertilization has occurred, a number of changes take place in the ovule and the ovary. That ovule will become the seed, and the ovary will become the fruit. Contained within the seed is the embryo. Now, different flowers produce different types of fruit, but in every case, you get these 4 changes taking place. That zygote, that initial fusing of the male and female nucleus and the cell containing it, develops into an embryonic plant. Now, that embryonic plant will have a small root, that's called a radicle, and a shoot, called a plumule. And they will be waiting inside the seed, inside the ovule, which will develop into a seed, waiting for the chance to break out, and the radicle to go down, and the plumule to go up. Now, the rest of the contents of the ovule develop into cotyledons. Those are the food stores for the young plant. Once the seed germinates, it will need food stores because it'll most likely germinate underground, and it won't have any leaves to start off with, so it won't be able to photosynthesize. The ovule wall, or the integuments, as we have them labeled on that diagram, become the seed coat, that hard seed coat, which is called the testa. And the ovary wall, the wall of the whole organ, the ovary, that becomes the fruit coat. And that will swell up in many cases and become a nice juicy fruit. Here's an example. So on the left we have the flower before and at pollination, and you can see it's still got its male parts attached onto it as well. It's still got the petals there, it's all well and good. And then the middle picture shows the flower just after fertilization, a day or so after fertilization. The petals, well, they're not needed anymore. Fertilization has occurred. We've had pollination, we've had fertilization. The style and the stigma, they're not needed. Their job is done. They shrivel up and, well, die back. But the ovary wall will now start swelling up. And you can see that the large central ovule, in this case, there's just one ovule, that has swollen up, that has got larger and has become the seed. And on the right-hand side, you can see the swollen ovary wall. It's now changed colour from being green to being red in this case. And what do you reckon? I think that might be a plum. What do you think? Who knows? What is the function of a fruit? Well, there are 2 functions. The first is to simply protect the seeds. But the second is to also disperse the seeds. Now, if all the seeds produced by a plant germinated in the same place, then there would be far too much competition between them for all the available resources, such as water, mineral ions, light. You can think of some others potentially. And to avoid this, and to avoid a parent plant competing with its own offspring, plants disperse their seeds. Some seeds are dispersed by the wind, and others by animals. And do not confuse the dispersal of seeds with pollination. They're very different processes. Squirrels are no use at all at pollination. You can't imagine a squirrel going from flower to flower carrying pollen around. No, you can't. But squirrels are very good at dispersing larger seeds such as acorns, horse chestnuts, that sort of thing. So, let's have a look at these seeds. They are dispersed by wind, and they're very small or light, and the fruits have wings or a parachute to catch the wind. These ones up here. So, this one here, wind dispersal, and you can see this is a dandelion fruit, and it's going to be carried off by the wind. This is a sycamore fruit. You'll probably know them more familiarly as helicopters. And again, that's going to be wind dispersal. However, these two here are going to be dispersed by animals. This one is a burdock fruit, and this will hook onto the fur of a passing mammal. And at some point it'll fall off, the mammal will scratch it off, scratch up against a fence post or whatever it might do. And that will have been dispersed somewhere else. The mammal will have carried it a considerable distance. And this one here, the tomato. Why do you get tomato plants growing by sewage outlets? Well, because when you eat a tomato plant, you eat the pips, you eat the seeds. And as your gut does its job, it'll digest the wall of the tomato fruit, but it won't digest the seeds themselves. And therefore, they will just pass straight through your gut and will leave in your feces. They will be egested. Now, of course, if they end up in a nice silty riverbank full of sewage where there's plenty of mineral ions for them to help them grow, you will get healthy tomato plants growing. Though personally, I wouldn't eat the fruit from it. Here are your questions on fruit formation. So have a go at answering these. Pause the video as you do, and then once you've answered them, move on. Germination, the final stage that we will consider. Our seed now contains a plant embryo, and that consists of a root and a shoot, a radicle and a plumule, and one or two seed leaves. They're called seed leaves, called cotyledons. You remember those cotyledons we had talked about in the earlier slide? And those cotyledons contain a store of starch and a store of protein. Now, during germination, the food store is used up, providing the nutrients to allow the radicle and the plumule to grow. The radicle grows downwards into the soil. There it can absorb water, it can absorb mineral ions. It will also give the germinating plant anchorage, so it doesn't get blown around all over the place. The plumule grows upwards towards the light, and at that point also the cotyledons have a separate and second function. They turn into the seed leaves, and with chlorophyll in chloroplasts, they will start to photosynthesize. And once the seedling is photosynthesizing, we consider germination to be complete. These are the stages in diagrammatic form. Typically, it's at first the radicle which breaks out like that. It will go down, you'll get root hairs developing there, and then also you will get the plumule coming out. And in this case, the plumule is pushing out here, and it's lifting with it the whole of the rest of the seed. These are cotyledons. They're not true leaves, but they will do photosynthesis towards the end of germination. And here are the first true leaves of this germinating plant. Now, you do need specific conditions for germination to occur. Seeds are typically very dry. They are produced containing very little water, and this means that a seed's metabolism will be restricted. And that means it can remain alive but dormant for a very long time, sometimes many, many years. When a seed germinates, it is because that dormancy has been broken. Now, it may be that this is an adaptation for the seed to wait for ideal conditions. It doesn't want to germinate at the wrong conditions at the wrong time, because if it does so, it will die quickly after that. What happens is the seed's food store is broken down by enzymes and respired aerobically. Now, we know about enzymes, and we just need to remind ourselves of the conditions that germination therefore needs. It needs warm temperatures so that those enzymes can act efficiently. It needs water because enzymes will only catalyze reactions when they are dissolved in water. And it requires oxygen for aerobic respiration. Notice that light is not a condition needed for germination. At germination, the embryonic plant is not photosynthesizing, so therefore light is not a condition needed for germination, nor is the presence of CO2. Then, when germinating, the seed uses the supplies of starch and lipid and protein and mineral ions which it has stored up in the cotyledons, which it has been gifted by its parent plant. And then it produces its first few leaves, photosynthesizes by itself, and generates its own food. Some questions, a final set of questions for you to consider. Go back over the video, have another listen, then read through these questions carefully and answer them. Thank you.